Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're digging into one of America's most formative periods, the early 1800s. You often hear it called the Jeffersonian era. And this wasn't some quiet time. It was a crucible where the very definition of the United States was being fought over, tested, and ultimately forged. We're talking about these grand visions, some really surprising contradictions, and decisions that honestly still ripple through today. For this deep dive, we've pulled together a really fascinating set of sources. They shine a light on the dramatic rise of political parties, those intense policy clashes shaping the young republic, and of course the ambitious westward expansion that literally redrew the map. So our mission today, to pull out those key nuggets of insight, helping you quickly get a handle on the key players, the core fights, and the lasting impact of this really pivotal time.
And it's just so crucial, this period, for understanding the tensions that, frankly, still run through American politics. Things like the scope of federal power, America's place in the world. We'll look at how these foundational decisions got made, often under incredible pressure. And maybe most interestingly, how figures like Thomas Jefferson had to balance their deeply held principles against, well, the practical realities of governing. It's kind of a masterclass in how precedents get set and how they stick around.
Yeah, and just as a way into the story, we have to mention the Revolution of 1800. I mean, what an astonishing, peaceful transfer of power. It really highlights the shifting political ground. Okay, let's unpack this. So diving into the early 1800s, the sources make it clear right away, this wasn't just about big names like Jefferson. This was the birth of national political parties. And their ideas weren't just a little different. They were fiercely opposed, driving these huge policy debates. So what were these fundamental disagreements, these core divides, and who were the main figures leading the charge?
Well, the striking thing is how deep these disagreements went. It wasn't just policy, it was about the fundamental character of the new nation. It mostly boiled down to two big questions. How much power should the federal government have, and what kind of economic future should America aim for? So on one side, you had the Federalists, think Alexander Hamilton. They argued for a strong, a vigorous central government, kind of essential, they thought, for stability and national growth. And they really championed manufacturing industry as the engine.
Okay, strong center, industry focused.
Right. Then, in pretty stark contrast, you had the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, their vision, much more agrarian, a nation of self-sufficient small farmers, the yeoman farmer ideal. They wanted a much more limited central government. Power, they felt, should stay closer to the states, to the people. They were really worried of anything that looked like the monarchies they'd just broken away from.
It's amazing thinking about those two visions clashing so hard. And then 1800 happens, this revolution of 1800. Jefferson wins. His Democratic Republicans take over from the Federalists. But maybe the most profound thing, like you said, for a brand new country, fresh out of its own revolution, to see one powerful group peacefully hand over control to their rivals without violence. How incredible was that at the time?
It's hard to overstate it, really. I mean, in so many other places, that kind of shift would have meant civil war, maybe a coup. But here, the system, the institutions, they held. It showed a real belief in the electoral process. Even though the election itself was messy and contested, it really did signal something about the strength, or at least the potential strength, of this new American experiment.
Right. So that sets the stage perfectly for the policy debates that followed. And they mostly circled back to those big questions: federal power and how America deals with Europe. Let's start with federal power, because Jefferson's presidency has some really interesting, almost contradictory moments.
It really does. Jefferson, coming in, was very true to his Democratic-Republican roots. He wanted to scale back federal power. For instance, he got Congress to repeal the whiskey tax. You remember, that tax had actually sparked an armed rebellion under Washington. Repealing it sent a clear message: less federal meddling. He also tried to shrink the military, cut federal jobs, all fitting that vision of a smaller, less intrusive central government.
But then comes this massive event that seems to go against everything he stood for, constitutionally speaking: the Louisiana Purchase. How did this huge land grab, doubling the country's size, fit with his ideas about limited government and sticking strictly to the Constitution?
Yeah, this is the classic example of Jefferson the pragmatist bumping up against Jefferson the philosopher. It's 1803. France, under Napoleon, had just had a major setback in Haiti. That defeat made the huge Louisiana territory, and especially that vital Mississippi River access, maybe less strategic or harder to hold for Napoleon. Jefferson's initial aim was actually pretty modest. He just wanted to secure the right for Americans to navigate the Mississippi, basic trade stuff. But then, Napoleon, needing cash for his wars in Europe, just suddenly offers James Monroe the entire Louisiana Territory, the whole thing, for $15 million.
Wow, just like that. An offer out of the blue. That must have thrown Jefferson for a loop. I mean, here's this incredible opportunity, but it slams right into his core belief in strict constructionism, the idea that the government can only do what the Constitution explicitly says it can do.
Exactly. And the Constitution says absolutely nothing about the president buying enormous chunks of land from other countries. Jefferson knew this. He wrestled with it. He even thought about trying for a constitutional amendment first.
But he didn't wait for an amendment, did he?
No, he didn't. The opportunity was just too good, too strategically important to pass up. He reasoned, maybe rationalized, that it secured vital trade routes, gave more room to push Native American tribes further west, and crucially, reduced European influence on the continent. So in the end, the vision of this continent-spanning republic won out, even if it meant, let's say, a flexible interpretation of the Constitution. It was a massive expansion of federal power and territory, done by a president who preached limited government.
So while Jefferson is, let's say, stretching executive power with the Louisiana Purchase, another part of the government is actively, almost aggressively, expanding its own power. The Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall. And what's so interesting here is Marshall himself was a Federalist. His party was losing political power, but he used the judiciary to shape the nation for decades. How did he do that?
Marshall was incredibly influential, probably did more to expand the power of both the federal government and the court itself than anyone. His first big move, and maybe his cleverest, was Marbury v. Madison in 1803. Remember, President Adams, right before leaving office, appointed a bunch of Federalist judges, the Midnight Judges. Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, refused to deliver their official commissions. So one of these judges, William Marbury, sued.
Okay, so Marbury wants his job. How does Marshall handle it?
It was brilliant politically. Marshall said, yes, Marbury technically has a right to his commission. But he then declared that the part of the Judiciary Act that Marbury was using to sue in the Supreme Court was actually unconstitutional. Why? Because, Marshall argued, the Constitution didn't explicitly give the Supreme Court the power to issue these kinds of orders in this type of case. So by denying Marbury what he wanted, Marshall cleverly avoided a direct fight with President Jefferson he probably couldn't win. But at the same time, he asserted this huge power for the court, the power of judicial review, the power to declare laws unconstitutional.
Wow, so by seemingly limiting the court's power in one small way, he grabbed a much bigger power for it overall. That's subtle.
Exactly. It established the Supreme Court as the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. And like you said, he wasn't done. Later on, in McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819, the issue was whether a state, Maryland in this case, could tax the National Bank, a federal entity. Marshall's ruling was twofold and profound. First, no, a state cannot tax the federal bank. And second, more broadly, whenever federal law and state law conflict, federal law is supreme. This really cemented the power of the federal government over the states and reinforced the judiciary's role in sorting out these constitutional questions. So even as Jefferson pushed for limited government, Marshall was building the stronger federal structure through the courts.
Okay, so we've got these internal debates shaping the U.S., but like we said, the country wasn't isolated. This was a dangerous world, especially with powerful European nations like Britain and France always in the mix. These external pressures also fueled domestic debates, didn't they? How did the U.S. try to navigate this?
Yeah, the international scene was definitely treacherous. Our sources point to a few key areas. Under Jefferson, early on, you have the Barbary Wars, roughly 1801 to 1805. For years, these North African states had demanded payments, tribute for safe passage for U.S. ships in the Mediterranean. Jefferson refused an increased demand, so he actually sent the U.S. Navy to retaliate. It was sort of an undeclared naval war, intermittent fighting for years. It ended with a compromise, a reduced payment, but it showed a new willingness to use force to protect American interests abroad. A bit of a shift for a president wanting a small military.
Right, using the Navy he perhaps didn't ideally want to build up.
Precisely. Then later, things really heated up with Britain and France interfering with American shipping during their own wars. A huge issue was the British practice of impressment, basically kidnapping American sailors off ships and forcing them into the British Navy, claiming they were deserters.
That sounds infuriating. How did Jefferson respond?
His response was controversial, the Embargo Act of 1807. It banned all American trade with all foreign nations. The idea was economic pressure hurt Britain and France enough that they'd respect U.S. neutrality.
A total ban. That must have caused uproar domestically. You've got farmers versus shippers again, right?
Absolutely furious debate.
Hmm.
Supporters, mainly Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, argued it was about national honor, a way to avoid war while still asserting American rights, economic coercion, essentially. But opponents, especially the Federalists up in New England, whose livelihoods depended on shipping and trade, called it disastrous. They argued it crippled the American economy far more than it hurt Europe. It really highlighted those deep regional economic splits.
And that experience, the vulnerability during the embargo and then the War of 1812, that leads into another key economic policy, right? The Tariff of 1816.
Exactly. After the War of 1812, there was this sense that America needed to be more self-sufficient, especially in manufacturing. The Tariff of 1816 was the first explicitly protective tariff in U.S. history. Its goal was to shield these young American industries from being swamped by cheap British imports now that the war was over.
So protectionism enters the picture. More division.
Oh, definitely. Supporters, mostly in the developing industrial North, saw it as vital for national economic strength, build our own industries. But critics, particularly in the agricultural South, hated it. They argued it just raised prices for consumers on imported goods they needed and unfairly favored northern factories over southern farms. Again, you see those north-south economic fault lines deepening.
And we can't skip the War of 1812 itself, even though it's technically under Madison. You mentioned impressment and shipping interference. What else pushed the U.S. into that war?
Besides impressment, another major factor was alleged British support, though historians debate how significant it really was for Native American confederacies who were resisting American settlers pushing westward. And domestically, you had this rising group in Congress, the War Hawks, mostly younger Democratic Republicans, very nationalistic, eager for war with Britain to defend American honor, maybe grab some land in Canada or Florida too.
But the Federalists hated this war, didn't they? I remember reading about the Hartford Convention. They actually talked about seceding.
They were vehemently opposed.
Yeah.
Yes, the Hartford Convention in late 1814 was where some frustrated New England Federalists met. Secession was discussed, though not formally proposed by the convention itself. It showed just how deep the divisions ran, how fragile the Union still felt to some.
But the war didn't end in disaster for the U.S., did it? What was the outcome?
No, America didn't lose. It was more of a stalemate, ending with the Treaty of Ghent, which basically restored the pre-war situation. But psychologically, it was huge. Surviving a second war with Britain led to this massive wave of nationalism across the country. People felt more truly American. Ironically, this surge in national feeling, combined with the Federalist opposition looking borderline treasonous after the Hartford Convention, basically finished off the Federalist Party as a national force. The Democratic Republicans became dominant.
Which brings us neatly back around to the land the Louisiana Purchase. Once the U.S. had this enormous territory, the government didn't just sit on it. They actively started exploring, mapping, and trying to assert control, right? Tell us about those expeditions.
Absolutely. The most famous, of course, is the Lewis and Clark expedition, 1804 to 1806. Jefferson himself commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was to explore this new Louisiana Purchase territory, find a water route to the Pacific if possible, map the land, study the plants, animals, resources, and establish contact with the Native American tribes living there.
And the impact was significant.
Immense. They produced incredibly detailed maps and journals. Their reports back east fired up imaginations about the potential of the West agriculture, trade. It definitely strengthened U.S. claims to the Oregon Territory by reaching the Pacific. And, importantly, it was also about asserting U.S. presence in this vast area, kind of staking a claim against potential rivals like Britain or Spain, and initiating relationships, however complicated, with dozens of native tribes.
Were there other major explorations happening around then?
Yes, another key one was Zebulon Pike's expedition in 1806. He was sent south and west, sort of towards the Spanish borderlands. He explored parts of the Arkansas and Red Rivers, saw the peak in Colorado that now bears his name, Pike's Peak. He actually got captured by the Spanish in what's now New Mexico, which really highlighted the contested nature of that southwestern border. His reports added a lot to American knowledge of the Rockies in the Southwest, though he also famously, and somewhat misleadingly, described the Great Plains as the Great American Desert, which for a while actually discouraged people from trying to settle there.
So, pulling all these threads together, the party battles, the policy fights over federal power and foreign relations, the push westward.
Now, if you zoom out, The Jeffersonian era was just this period of incredibly intense foundational debate. What should the government do? What kind of economy should we have? How do we deal with the rest of the world? It was a time when the nation was really wrestling with its identity, dramatically expanding its borders, and crucially defining that balance of power within its own government, between branches and between federal and state authority.
So what's the takeaway for you listening today? Why does understanding this era matter? Well, it gives you this crucial lens for seeing how American political arguments developed, how federal power grew, sometimes in ways the founders, like Jefferson, didn't exactly intend. And you see how that drive for westward expansion got baked into the national DNA early on. It's also, I think, a powerful reminder that even leaders with really strong principles often end up making pragmatic choices, maybe driven by events that have consequences reaching far into the future. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Think about that revolution of 1800. It brought Jefferson to power, someone who championed limited government. Yet, how did his own actions as president, especially something like the Louisiana Purchase, or even fighting the Barbary Wars, end up laying the groundwork for a more powerful, more expansive federal government than his own ideology would seem to allow? It's a fascinating contradiction, and definitely something worth mulling over as you reflect on this deep dive.